Hey everybody, this is episode 15 of From Guns to Keyboards. It hasn't really been that long, but it's felt like a long
Episode
time.
15, that's insane.
I mean, episode 14 was only 2 weeks ago, but it feels like, I don't know if it's just the reality that we're living in right now, but it feels like a month since we last talked. This time we're going to skip the news recap just because there's a lot of things we want to get into. And I think first and foremost, the thing that literally and figuratively hit closest to home was the drone attack last night on a Tel Aviv apartment building next to the U.S. consulate in Tel Aviv. So this attack was recently, this morning, claimed. The Houthis claimed responsibility for it. The attack happened about 3 a.m. this morning. Several hours later, the Houthis claimed responsibility. The Houthis are the sort of rebel unit. I guess they're not really a rebel unit anymore. They de facto control half of Yemen, the western half, and they are threatening more and more attacks on Tel Aviv. They kind of gave themselves a little bit of an out, though. They said as their weapons permit, so it's unclear what their long range capabilities are, but I'm sure they have more than just one drone able to do so. I guess, Michael, I want to turn it over to you. How did this, because you know a bit more about military intelligence, how was this drone able to evade and surpass all of Israel's defense and alert systems?
So, from what I understand, apparently Israel's alert systems were aware of the drone, meaning that it wasn't that the drone wasn't identified, it just wasn't properly shot down. And, I have to say, even starting from last night when I was going to an event for my reserve duty unit, I saw on the GPS on my phone that my phone showed me that I was located in Cairo. And that's obviously the result of some sort of GPS blocking that one typically sees if they're in the north or the south of Israel near a border where Israel uses GPS blocking technology against Hamas and Hezbollah. But I saw that GPS blocking going on in the center. So last night I kind of looked at my phone and said, this is a little bit fishy. Why is there GPS blocking in the center of the country where I am? I wonder what's going on. And within 6 hours of that happening, seeing the strike in Tel Aviv where a drone pummels into a building, kills one, and injures almost a dozen, at least up to this point. That's what we know about the casualty count from this attack. And like I said, it really seems as if the air defense system was aware of the attack. It seems that we were able to identify the drone. The failure here was on the counterattack against the drone. That's where the system failed to respond.
Yeah, it's nuts. And it's interesting, too, that excuse me, I think, as apologies to everybody, as you can also hear, Michael's a little sick.
I lost my voice this week, but after seeing the attempted assassination on Mohammed Deif, the attempted assassination on Donald Trump, and waking up this morning to an explosion near my apartment, I said, voice, no voice, I'm coming to record episode 15.
We have to. Like I said, too much to discuss. So what's interesting to me is the timing of the Houthi attack, because we're starting to see, for the first time in this entire war, the momentum is starting to shift over to Israel a little bit. I think that's not a coincidence. We have a series of elections going on in Europe and the United States. These countries are now very focused domestically on what's going on within their own borders. I think they're a little less concerned about the Israel-Hamas war. I also have to give the Israelis credit, to which is something that I don't do very often, as Michael's off to remind me, which is that the Israelis have very much toned down the aggressiveness of their attacks. We're seeing far fewer civilian casualties, not that they don't exist, but far fewer superfluous civilian casualties, much more target assassinations. It's also giving the Israelis the opportunity to do things that they didn't really have up until now. For instance, there was recently an assault once again on Gaza City, and rather than going neighborhood by neighborhood and telling these neighborhoods to evacuate, Israel simply told everyone in Gaza City to leave. And I think that that's part of just the fact that these allies of Israel are too involved in their own domestic issues and their own domestic concerns to really pay too much mind to Hamas. And Hamas certainly seems to feel this. And we've seen that, I think, because recently they've acquiesced to some of the prime minister's harsher demands. For instance, agreeing to a round of hostage releases without a guaranteed end to the war. That is unprecedented up until this point. That's something that Hamas has agreed to. So they do seem to be folding a little bit on the agreement. And right when it seems like momentum is picking up, the Houthis are attacking Tel Aviv all of a sudden.
Right.
This, to me, is... it may just be coincidence, and I'm sure as more time progresses and we get more details, we'll start to learn more and more. But I don't think it's too coincidental. I don't know. What do you think, though?
Well, look, I think that to a certain degree, it is a reminder for all of us that we will never have a perfect answer for terrorism on all fronts, especially when we're dealing with the attacks like the we saw from the Houthis this morning, where we woke up to explosions in Tel Aviv. We're never going to be able to give an answer to terror on all fronts. There will always be terror attacks, and no matter how much we invest in the south and the north, you're going to have the Houthis coming out of Yemen and shooting long-range drones at you from over the Mediterranean Sea. So I think that's one reminder that we really learned from this case with the Houthis. I think the other reminder is really what is the military response that Israel can give to the Houthis. Israel never in all of its wars invested in the necessary military technology to fight these sorts of grand scale overseas battles. It always invested in nearby ground maneuvers against its neighboring Arab states and in the immediate theater of battle. Never really thought about what war would look like going on against rebel groups in Yemen or far off in deeper theaters. And I don't really think Israel has a clear military answer to the Houthis the way it would to a more nearby country.
So just to clarify that, are you just reserving judgment whether this was a coincidence or not, or are you just a sort of, because it seems like you think it's more of just a random terrorist attack?
Look, I don't think it's a coincidence in the sense that I think that the Houthis are trying to, for the same reason that Hezbollah is getting involved to support Hamas. Yeah, I think Hezbollah has like a domestic political gain that it's trying to bring about in order to gain support against Israel as Israel fights the war against Hamas. I think the Houthis play that same game where, from their perspective, shooting drones at Tel Aviv kind of gives them the card of supporting the Palestinian and Islamic resistance against Israel. I think that's their gain here. So I don't think it's just a random attack. I think it's part of...
No, it's certainly part of a strategic alliance with Hamas in the region. I think that personally, and again, I just think the timing of the attack, for instance, the Houthis have had this capability since the beginning of the war. Why have they waited so long to start using it? Why do they not assist, for instance, when Iran launches long-range weapons into Israel? Why do they not assist also from a separate front in order to make life more difficult for the coalition trying to take down these missiles? I think that this is why I think this is part of a larger strategic game and a sign of deep political and diplomatic coordination between elements in Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran, and the Houthis in order to try and reduce this momentum that Israel seems to find itself gaining and to cause Israel to come back to the table with lesser demands.
You know, it's really funny you mentioned that, because it really does bring us to the next topic of our conversation in this podcast, which is Bibi's upcoming speech in Washington sometime next week. There is a theory out there that when Bibi comes to Washington to speak, his main narrative in his speech is going to be exactly what you said. He's going to go to Washington and he's going to discuss this Iranian-led strategic resistance against Israel that plays out with the Houthis striking from Yemen, with Hezbollah shooting rockets in the north, with Hamas acting in Gaza, and that's going to be the main focus of his speech. But yeah, to answer your question, whether or not this is a coordinated attack led by Iran or just a sporadic attack coming out of Yemen, who knows? My gut instinct tells me that when it comes to deeply influenced Iranian proxies like the Houthis in Yemen or Hezbollah in Lebanon, that Iran is involved one way or another, and more likely than not that Iran is playing out its different players in the region and slowly chipping away at the Zionist regime, as they like to call us.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, it certainly seems that with these much more expensive, I would say, and much more industry heavy attacks or infrastructurally heavy attacks, that there is some sort of coordination happening. Just because I can't imagine an attack like this for the Houthis is terribly cheap. I mean, one thing with this war it's really been defined by is, and this can lead to also a larger discussion, but these very expensive, industrious, heavy weapons that you see on like the Israeli and American side going up against cheap RPGs, Kalashnikovs, motorbikes, and explosive-laden drones. And for something like this, though, for something like that's much more of a long-range missile or a long-range drone attack, it's certainly not expensive in the way that a Tomahawk missile is expensive, but it is definitely not something that can be used quite as frivolously as what we're seeing in the Red Sea with the Yemen attacks on a lot of trade and shipping.
Did you wake up yesterday to the attack?
I didn't wake up. My wife woke up, though, and she said, so we live on the 23rd story, about 2 kilometers, about a mile and a half away from where the attack actually happened. She said it was a very loud explosion, that the windows to our bedroom shook. And that shortly after that explosion, she heard a bunch of sirens, like, police sirens, that sort of thing. And that's when she realized, like, wow, something happened. And she turned on the news, and all she saw, was explosion happening in Tel Aviv, reports to follow. And it wasn't until about 30 minutes to an hour later that she got the word that this was an attack and that something had really happened. I slept through the whole thing. I don't wake up for anything except for my son crying, and that's a blessing. And
I'm with you there. I also slept through it.
Yeah, and you were much closer too. I was shocked when you told me right before we started recording that you didn't hear it. Because you live just a couple blocks away.
A couple blocks away, yeah, not that far.
Man,
didn't hear anything.
That's crazy.
It's amazing what drinking a couple glasses of whiskey before you go to sleep can do to you.
You sleep through anything. I don't even need it. I just fall asleep. But yeah, no. So it does seem that the war is coming closer to home. It'll be interesting to see kind of what this does to ratchet up the pressure potentially on Israel. The mayor of Tel Aviv currently says that Tel Aviv is now on high alert. GPS systems appear to be working. When I turned on my GPS, I'm not in Cairo or Beirut, but there's certainly I got the notification that my compass is bad. I need to do the whole figure 8 with the phone in order to fix it. So it does appear that for the meantime there was certainly going to be precautionary measures taken, including, according to the Air Force, more aerial flights. The IAF, by the way, the Israeli Air Force, claimed full responsibility for the failure of defending against this attack. No word from the Prime Minister, unsurprisingly, unlike this past Saturday, where he was very front and center at a press conference after the IDF announced the potential assassination, because nothing has been fully confirmed, of Mohammed Deif, the head of the military wing of Hamas. Michael, can you tell us a little bit about this guy? Because I feel like you know a lot more about him than I do.
Mohammed Deif is the equivalent to the American chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He is the head of Hamas's military wing, the head of Hamas's army, in the full sense of the word. He is considered by Israel to be the arch-terrorist responsible both for October 7th, alongside Sinwar, and also for just about every major terrorist attack against Israel for the past 20, 30 years. Israel's tried to kill Mohammed Deif 7 times before this last assassination attempt that we saw over the past week. 7 times, and every single time you see on the news that he loses parts of his leg, he loses parts of his hip, and then you see that he's suddenly walking and you realize, oh, he didn't lose his hip, he lost part of his hand. And every attack seems to take off a little chip of Mohammed Deif, but he somehow manages to wiggle his way out and stay alive. And the attack on Mohammed Deif and the attempted assassination of him is, I think, from an Israeli perspective, broken down into 2 main goals. The first main goal is a strategic goal of wiping out the Hamas's leadership as a part of Israel's counterinsurgency strategy in the Gaza Strip. If Israel does have a counterinsurgency strategy, that's a whole other conversation.
Big one, yeah.
But definitely one of Israel's goals in the Gaza Strip is to wipe out Hamas's leadership. And I think Israel, on the other hand, needs to have some sort of major PR victory in the battle against Hamas to kind of justify it going into a hostage deal with the Hamas organization going forward. And I think killing Mohammed Deif can allow Bibi to justify to the domestic Israeli public, we beat Hamas and now we're okay to go.
I think it will give the Israeli leadership and the Israeli society as a whole the confidence to say that there was a victory against Hamas if the masterminds of October 7th are dead and underground. I think that without that, the whole Netanyahu show of total victory will never come to pass, and he will be seen as the failure. And yes, to tie back to my original point, Bibi was very much there at the press conference, which was actually exciting to see him talk. Of course, again, Netanyahu is very much only there when there's good news to deliver. Whenever there's bad news, the man is nowhere to be found. That's my rant over. I'm not going to go into a whole Bibi rant, so just end it right there. But yes, I guess the question then is, so if Mohammed Deif is killed, and the reason there is a question mark is exactly what Michael said, because there have been 7 past assassination attempts. None of them have succeeded. So the Israeli intelligence is very reticent to make a confident claim one way or another that he's dead. Just as a side note, before I ask the question, Mohammed Deif was meeting with the brigade commander of the Khan Yunis brigade from Hamas. They were above ground in a humanitarian zone when the area was struck. There is confirmation that the Khan Yunis brigade commander was killed, so not a minor player at all. Deif himself was, again, the question mark. They were both above ground at the time, which is extraordinary and unexpected. But it is believed that due to just Mohammed Deif's health problems, he needed to come above ground and have this meeting. And I guess they believe they were safe in the humanitarian zone, which again goes to a much broader question of obviously Israel attacking UNRWA schools and humanitarian zones whenever they suspect terrorists or leadership there, and the efficacy of that and the morality behind that. But regardless, Hamas is definitely using it to their advantage whenever they can. So anyway, my question for you, Michael, is do you think this will have, let's say Deif is killed, will this have a major effect on hostage negotiations?
I think it definitely will. I think that from Hamas's perspective, it will have a short-term effect where it will make it a little bit more difficult for Hamas in the immediate term to agree to a deal because it will make them seem weak. But in the long term, I think that Hamas will look at this as a major blow to them, and they will understand that they're going to have to come to the table with some sort of offer. And I think it'll allow Israelis to, quote-unquote, save face and come to the table and make a deal with Hamas. But again, the question is whether or not Mohammed Deif is actually dead. And if you ask my personal opinion, while military intelligence hasn't come out one way or another, if I had to make a bet, I think that the strike killed him. I think that the chance, I know this guy's escaped 7 assassination attempts, and it's hard to say with Mohammed Deif, but the chance of escaping 5 tons coming from the sky and falling on you and every single place around you. And just to make it perfectly clear, after dropping 5 tons of munitions on where Mohammed Deif was suspected to be, the Israeli Air Force took no chances and bombed every potential escape route going in and out of this area where Mohammed Deif and the Khan Yunis brigade commander were suspected to be. The brigade commander that he met with is already confirmed dead, as Dillon mentioned. And with all of this data at play, I would say that is more likely than not that Mohammed Deif is no longer among the living. I will say one other interesting point, that a spokesperson for Hamas made a comment after the strike saying Mohammed Deif is very much at play and is laughing at you, referencing Benjamin Netanyahu laughing at you for thinking that you could take him out. And there was a former member of the Shabak that analyzed the comment that this Hamas spokesperson made and said that the language that he used in Arabic to describe Mohammed Deif laughing at Benjamin Netanyahu is language that is kind of like gray area translation, where it could mean that Mohammed Deif is still alive and is laughing at Bibi, or it could be translated as Mohammed Deif is in the afterlife and is laughing at Bibi from the afterlife. It was kind of vaguely worded.
Interesting.
So that might be one potential sign that he's no longer with us.
And I think for Hamas, it actually makes a lot of sense for them to kind of keep it, regardless if he's alive or dead, to keep it kind of under wraps for a while, to kind of show and remind the Israelis that their intelligence is never perfect, and that it creates that distrust that they're looking for between Israel and its security apparatus. Look, I'm sure that's interesting what you said about the Air Force taking every precaution. I didn't know about that. Of course, had he walked away from the meeting 5 minutes earlier than before the planes got there, he may very well still be alive. But if what you're saying is true, and I believe it that it's true, I would assume that the odds are likely. But I don't know. If I survived 7 assassination attempts, I'd probably be a religious fundamentalist too, because I get somebody up there loves me and wants me to do something.
Right. I mean, look, you've seen this yourself in Gaza when a 1-ton bomb strikes a building. It doesn't just destroy the building that it strikes. It completely damages the immediate area around it, and much of the immediate area around it is not going to look the same even when you only strike that one building. You drop 5 of those things on an area. Yeah. I mean, especially if he was actually above ground when this happened, the chances that he somehow got out alive is low, but you never know with this cockroach. You never know. You don't.
He's certainly a big player. Actually, just as a side note, on the day of October 7th, I ended up switching to Al Jazeera at one point, just to kind of see what they were saying. I was just curious, how is Al Jazeera going to spin this or whatever. And interestingly enough, they were the only news channel in English at least that they had a live interview with Mohammed Deif on the day of the attack. Wow. And he was very much the mastermind of this attack. And for him, he was very much glorifying the fighters and the attack itself. And I do remember, though, the Al Jazeera reporter asked him, at the time, well, what do you think this is going to do to Gaza? How are the Israelis going to respond to this? And they're like, oh, don't worry, we've planned for it, and if they attack, great, we'll just have more hostages. That doesn't seem to have happened. As far as we know, no Israeli soldier has been taken alive or dead, despite the suspicion that was their intent. And hopefully, I mean, I hope that the Israeli Air Force got him. I really do. Yeah. I hope that the undoubted collateral damage that happened was for the cause of preventing future October 7th attacks. Obviously, this goes back to my whole point with Israel and counterinsurgency and the sort of despair that has with this war. But regardless, if there's one person that deserves to die, it's certainly him. And I would be very happy to see that intelligence is confirmed. All right. Shall we skip across the pond?
Skip across the pond.
Back to our homeland, because there's a lot going on in the United States, a lot of which pertains to Israel. And the question, I think, is, you mentioned earlier, Bibi's speech. It's in a week. He will be flying to Washington, D.C. at the same time I will, also for work, but not for political reasons, just for tech reasons. And Bibi will be giving a speech in front of Congress. This is actually, I think, going to be Bibi's 5th speech to Congress, which actually puts him as the foreign leader with the most amount of speeches to Congress. Before this, he was tied with Winston Churchill at 4. Winston Churchill, by the way, is Bibi's sort of personal hero. He, in his autobiography and in speeches, he very much admires Winston Churchill. He compares himself to Winston Churchill. Even in his just behavior, he smokes cigars, he drinks expensive champagne. I'm sure he's got a bottle of Johnny Walker Red Label on hand, like Churchill did. He very much sees himself as Winston Churchill, and so for him, this is a big moment for him personally, and it will be very interesting to see kind of what he talks about in this speech, because there's certainly a tightrope that he has to walk, in the sense that it's quite obvious. There's been no secret amongst his coalition members that they want Donald Trump to win. At the same time, there has never been a U.S. president more just in Israel's camp than Joe Biden. And regardless of the withholding of the 2,000-pound bombs. So, yeah, I think it's going to be interesting to see what he says. And, Michael, how do you predict the speech going?
Look, I think there's 2 main tracks that the speech can go down. The first track is, and I call this the unlikely track, is Bibi trying to win bipartisan support for Israel going forward. That's one possibility. I don't see that happening, but that is definitely one possibility, where Bibi goes to Washington and gives his grand speech talking about shared U.S.-Israeli values and the U.S.-Israel relationship, and going back to the time of Moses and Judeo-Christian shared values up until today. I think that's one potential path, and then tying that into the evil Hamas organization that attacked Israel on October 7th, and we are together fighting against this evil organization. That's one track. The other and more likely track is Bibi taking advantage of America's political situation, where you have a weakened Joe Biden going up against a now much stronger Donald Trump, coming out strong against against an assassination attempt on him not too long ago. A much stronger candidate going up against Joe Biden, who is considered by many to be senile and unable and unfit for office. And the likely track that I think Bibi will go down is to basically take advantage of that American political situation, and maybe not in a direct way, but in an implicit and clear enough way in Washington passive-aggressive political discourse, go off against Joe Biden's recent policies against Israel, holding up arms shipments, holding up support for Israel on the diplomatic front, and de facto giving a pitch for what Trump was pushing for at the most recent RNC convention for Israel.
Interesting. I actually would view his speech as a combination of the two. I think the speech is very much going to start with what you said. Bibi really emphasizing the U.S.-Israel relationship, very much talking about the shared Judeo-Christian values. He loves to go on about that, about Judaism and Christianity and the West in general struggle against Islam, the evil Islamic empire that has gotten its tentacles around various institutions around the West. He loves talking about that and reminding everyone about this, and then from there, and I honestly think he's going to pay a lot of lip service to Joe Biden, just thanking him for his support and things like that. I then think he's going to pivot and speak, maybe not in such a direct way, not like Joe Biden's not, but he's like, but should Israel, because of our shared relationship, I think that the best thing, Israel, he always calls Israel, the sort of the first line of defense against Islam, against radical Islam for the United States. Israel's in the Middle East. They're taking the brunt of the terrorist attacks in order to keep the United States safe, sort of acting as a sponge in that sort of way. And I think he's saying to America, this is why you have this interest to give us these weapons, to give us what we need, to let us take the gloves off, because we're not just keeping ourselves safe, we're keeping you safe. And I think that that's more likely the path that Bibi's going to take, and obviously a lot of things he will say will kind of align with Trump, with Trump's more recent pivot towards how he views the Israel-Hamas war and the idea of kind of what we talked about last time, taking the gloves off and letting the Israelis just do whatever they have to do in order to end the war. I think Trump actually said in a recent speech, he called it ripping off the Band-Aid.
Yeah.
Just letting Israel do what they need for the next month or two so that the war can end, the hostages can come home, and that will be that. But yeah, I don't think he's quite stupid enough, or I don't think he would do, I don't think stupid is the word, but I don't think he's going to do something as aggressive as really pointing the finger at the Democrats and at Joe Biden.
Yeah, I think you're right about that one. I think your analysis is accurate. I think that if he goes after Biden, it'll be in very passive-aggressive, classic Washington discourse, using implicit language that doesn't really cross any lines, but is enough to make it clear about his dissatisfaction with Joe Biden, kind of like what he did the last time he came to Washington, or one of the last times he came to Washington, where he went out against Obama's stated policy of reconciliation with the Iran nuclear agreement. And, he wasn't actively saying, President Obama, what you're doing is wrong, but he was saying that, in fact, in an implicit way.
I think he was much more aggressive against Obama. He didn't say, Obama, you're wrong in quite such stark political terms, but he said this policy is a wrong policy, kind of basically saying, Obama, you're wrong. I think he really understood while that was kind of a high water mark for him within internal Israeli domestic politics, in terms of the American-Israel relationship, that was very much seen as the beginning of the end between the democratic support for Israel and Israel itself. I think he really saw the damage that he did. I don't think he's going to come swinging quite as hard. And I just don't think he feels like he needs to. At the end of the day, it does seem, polls seem to be showing that Trump will come out ahead at the end of this race, that he will have a Republican president who back in the helm, who is, regardless, look, about Trump, there's a lot to say about whether or not he's going to fully support Israel, but the Republican Party as a united front seems very much in support of Israel, to the point where, regardless of Trump's personal feelings and personal take, it might be very difficult for him to do anything less than give Israel full support. So for Bibi, I think he sees, why do I need to go so hard against the Democrats? They're going to be gone anyways. The fact that I'm even here is a big, F you to the Democrats anyways. So I'm just going to talk, I'm just going to pay Biden some lip service and then sort of kind of subtly make a speech into where I can frame having a policy of Israel takes the gloves off as in America's best interest.
Yeah, well, I think the question you bring up really does make us ask a deeper question, which is, what is Bibi's goal in this speech? What does he want to get out of the speech? And, I think if you break it down to the American audience on the one hand versus the Israeli audience on the other hand, you can really see that the interests of these two audiences are very different, yeah? You have the American audience where, like you said, Bibi doesn't really have an interest in going after Biden at this point, because Biden seems like a lame duck president that's going to be leaving office, and I think you're right about that. But when you look at an Israeli audience here, what do Israelis like to hear?
You make a good
Israelis
point.
love to see a strong Israeli leader standing up to the big foreign powers and the big American guns in this case. And, if Bibi goes up and he stands up for what he thinks is right and puts his foot down, I think that'll play out very well domestically amongst Bibi supporters.
I think it will play well amongst his supporters. It will certainly play out well for his far-right coalition members, who that's what they've been saying publicly for months now anyways. I guess for Bibi, though, it is a bit of it's a tough question how he's going to make that balance. But you're right, you do make a good point of how he wants this to play out in the Israeli media. I think for him, looking at it from where I'm sitting from just a purely rational perspective, I don't think he really needs to do too much more to garner the support of his people. His people are, we see in the polls, he's rising anyways. His people are very much behind him. Far right is, they'd like him to be more aggressive, but they understand he's their champion. I think for Bibi, in terms of domestic political issues, I mean, look, the greater issue that could bring him down, honestly, is this Haredi draft bill, which I think that is more than anything. And I don't know if making such a strong speech that could have some serious short-term ramifications. At the end of the day, he makes this speech in a week, right? We still have 4 more months until the election and 6 more until the next president actually takes office. There's a lot that the Americans can still do between now and then to really screw this war up for Israel. And I think that's the biggest risk that Bibi needs to face. In terms of domestic issues, I think for him, honestly, for Bibi, he really also just needs to make it 1 more week, and then Knesset will go on their summer recess. And that's incredibly significant, just because once they're on recess, it's incredibly hard to reconvene them. And Bibi is essentially guaranteed to stay in office until end of October, at the very least. There will be no elections until then. So for him, this speech could not be coming at a better time. I think just the fact that he's even there in Congress is going to be enough for the Israelis. For an Israeli population that's so used to seeing all this anti-Israel protest and rhetoric coming in from the West, to have their prime minister standing in front of Congress and having, each sentence he says receive a standing ovation, because I'm sure it will, as it's what pretty much happens every time, is going to be enough for them to really boost that morale and to really rally themselves back around the leader.
I agree with everything you said, and I think from Bibi's perspective, when he looks at how everything you said plays out on a calendar in terms of the way in which he attains and grows political support in Israel, I think the calendar that he's building is as follows. He's going to give a speech to Congress, and he's going to rally up domestic support for the prime minister going forward in negotiations with Hamas. He's going to, at a certain point before the speech or after the speech, claim that Israel successfully killed Mohammed Deif, giving him even further support and credibility to go into a deal. And then he's going to make a deal with Hamas during the Knesset recess, where he'll have that flexibility to basically go into a deal and see that Israel's coming out stronger. And when all this happens, he could show that in the deal, Israel got concessions from Hamas that Hamas was never willing to do, and that was all due to the fact that Bibi was a super strong prime minister that stood up to Hamas's demands and didn't give up for a second, facing off against the evil Hamas organization in the Gaza Strip. I think that's how Bibi wants the next couple months to play out.
And you know what? To be what's interesting enough is actually Bibi's sort of military pressure only. I have to say it does seem to be working, at least for now. Like it's not working in the sense that it's going to create any long-term peace, but it's working in the sense that it's forcing Hamas to the table and to soften their demands for a hostage negotiation release. Of course, the counter argument to this side is, well, for every week and every month that Israel waits to make a deal, more and more hostages are dying.
Right.
And there is a sense of urgency and with time that Netanyahu just doesn't really seem to feel or care about, quite frankly. He's I think you said it very succinctly in one of the past episodes. This is a man who has a political calculus that starts and stops with, how do I stay in office for 1 more day? Right. And he's also one of those guys who one thing I've noticed in this war is that he's incredibly averse to risk, it appears. He's not the kind of guy who likes, despite his sort of his posture as being the prime minister who's big on defense and very hawkish, he does not like taking major risks. And that includes military risks as well. I think that's the only reason why we haven't opened up a war with Lebanon. So in that way, I'm at least a little bit grateful to it. But that does seem to be the man in a nutshell.
And in terms of how that approach affects Sinwar, I recently read an article that tried to analyze what is Sinwar's decision-making regarding the potential for a deal with Israel in light of the hardening stance coming from the Israeli Prime Minister and the military action that Israel's carrying out in the Gaza Strip. And the analysis that I read, I think it was in the New York Times that I read this, if I remember correctly, was that Sinwar does not care about dying. From his perspective, he knows that his fate is already sealed, and he is not particularly concerned about dying. He is very concerned about how the increasing destruction of Gaza will affect his legacy. And there is an aspect there of how far can Sinwar, what is his timeline here fighting against the Israelis? Typically, terror organizations have a much longer timeline of destruction than the counterinsurgent force in these sorts of battles. So in the long run, I do think Sinwar has a much more advantageous timeline than the Israelis do. But the question is, how long can he play this out before Bibi runs out the clock on him?
Well, what's interesting, too, is this is, you know, this is kind of a separate conversation, but just one I want to open up with is I just think it's very interesting, which is the difference in 21st century to 20th century warfare. And what's so fascinating about 21st century warfare in comparison is that 20th century warfare was very much defined by short maneuver warfare. You wanted quick, decisive battles that involved a lot of heavy armor and artillery and air force that could really create that, you know, that could surround and force people onto the battlefield and surrendering. What's different with the 21st century is just that the timeline is now extended extraordinarily. Wars are no longer decided in, you know, just a few short years. We're talking multi-decade wars. And this has actually been the message that Bibi's been trying to give to the Israeli public, that the war in Gaza, this is not a temporary situation like the Israelis are used to. The Israelis, more than anybody, are used to short, decisive wars. It's how the IDF it has written their military doctrine. It's the way that we're trained to behave as soldiers and as intelligence people. It's just the way that we operate. And Bibi is very much trying to change that calculus into saying that, look, this is a long war that's going to go on for decades. And what's interesting there is that, you know, that's all fine and good, and you can change your military doctrine in order to match that. But it's also, at the end of the day, what I mentioned earlier is that, you know, we're fighting when you're fighting a war in an extended timeline like this, you're fighting an insurgent group that can spend, you know, a couple $1,000s on explosive-laden drones that can do extraordinary damage to your armored corps, to your individual soldiers on the ground, to your civilian population. Whereas for Israel, everything we use is extremely expensive. It's very difficult to replace. And this causes a big strategic disadvantage when fighting a war like this. I guess, so to the question that I want to ask then is, how long do we think this war can go for before eventually, who has the shorter timeline? I know you said that Sinwar might have the longer one. But do you stand by that then, that Sinwar has the long timeline, or do you think that he's running out of time too?
I think Sinwar's running out of time. I think by nature, because he's an insurgent force, he has a longer timeline because the Israelis have to, you know, at the end of the day, are going to increasingly suffer military casualties in Gaza. There's going to be always civilian casualties nearby in the Gaza envelope. That will never be avoided 100%. And at a certain point, enough pressure will be applied on Israel to scale down operations in Gaza. Maybe not fully, but to scale down operations in Gaza in order to keep its people safe. Whereas Sinwar has a much higher tolerability, like many insurgent forces, to suffer a lot of damage against his people and against his armed groups. But it doesn't mean it's eternal tolerability, meaning he will face some sort of point at which he's going to say this is too much. And at the end of the day, Sinwar wants to, you know, even though he's not looking out for his own life here in the way that other politicians might look out for their own life, at the end of the day, you know, the ideal for him, if it's somehow possible for him, is to continue Hamas influence one way or another. That doesn't necessarily mean civilian rule, but Hamas influence one way or another in the Gaza Strip. And if Israel is looking to fight an eternal war in Gaza, he cannot do that the way that he was doing that before October 7th. And, you know, it's important to remind that, you know, definitely Israel fought mainly decisive wars in its history, but for something like 50 years now, Israel has been occupying, from a military perspective, the West Bank, and is, until today, from 1967 until today, carrying out counter and terrorist operations throughout the West Bank, in Palestinian cities and towns and villages. And maybe we might just be making the same decision about Gaza, saying, just like we're 50 years in the West Bank, and that war, quote unquote, never really ended, and went through different peaks during the Intifadot and different peaks during certain rounds of fighting. It just kept going with us until today. That's just going to be the new normal in Gaza.
Yeah, and honestly, I think you might be right about that. That is very much going to be, for the Israelis, at least for as long as they can and maintain it, the new normal in Gaza. The other thing I'll point out too is that Israel has also been adapting its military strategies on the battlefield as well, using a lot more also inexpensive drones. There's a ton of footage coming out for these very small, they're like circular, they have a single rotor, I don't know exactly what they're called, but they're single rotary drone that can actually make its way through houses and can clear houses for soldiers before they go in. They're incredibly effective. There's numerous videos actually that have come out of drones spotting these small drones spotting terrorists, sometimes even sleeping in the houses, leaving, and then the house being blown up. And it's a great way as well for the Israelis to ensure that there's not going to be such dire civilian casualties for these strikes. They can still take out low-level Hamas fighters without endangering, dozens of civilians and thus causing them more international damage in terms of their image. Israel, it certainly seems to be, is at this point now incentivized to start producing, manufacturing, and using less expensive gear and weaponry, and not relying on, Lockheed Martin and Raytheon technologies, which are going to cost them billions and billions of dollars.
Yeah.
So it'll be interesting to see kind of how this, and this is, by the way, something that the world is very much watching, trying to understand what is the next phase of fighting terrorism, of counterinsurgency, essentially.
Well, the way that I look at it is, I agree with you that there is an understanding that some, quote unquote low tech, or maybe not low tech, it's better to say, not non-expensive military equipment
Economical.
Very economical equipment can have a very significant impact on the battlefield. I think you're 100% right. My perspective on this change is largely one of an Israeli understanding that it needs to invest in its soldiers on the ground in order to carry out the necessary damage against Hamas. I think that's Israel's main conclusion coming out of the fighting from October 7th until today, where Israel realized that if combat engineers, tankists, and infantrymen on the ground don't have the equipment that they need to fight against Hamas terrorists, then they're not going to carry out the necessary damage they need to win the war. And this really goes against the earlier approach of Israel, which you mentioned earlier when you discussed Lockheed Martin, the earlier approach of Israel, which was, we have our amazing Air Force, which can strike with very precise intelligence any target throughout the Middle East. We also have ground forces that can help us if we need to do a ground maneuver at a certain point, but we don't have to invest as much in the ground forces as we do in the Air Force, because our Air Force is really our special sauce here.
Right.
And I think that, when you talk about using these single rotor or very simple multi-rotor drones that one can buy online on Amazon and using them for certain purposes, I think that like the one of the outcomes is that it's more economical, but I think that the focus here is not on economics as much as it is a focus on using the ground forces, which are really Israel's true secret sauce in taking down Hamas in the Gaza Strip, and empowering them as much as possible with the equipment that they need.
I think to be honest, I think it's a combination of both, but I think you're absolutely right. I think, look, at the beginning of the war, I can say that when we first got to the base on October 8th, there was a beg, borrow, and steal mentality. I remember we had one of the commanders of the Yalom unit show up to us. This was, I think, on October 9th. He had just come from fighting in the south. Like, he had just come from the kibbutzim. It was this like kind of short, broad Yemeni guy who made us all gather around. He's like, look, this is the gear you have. If that's a problem, it's your problem. Figure it out. And it was this very just sort of like, this is a situation. Mommy and daddy aren't coming to help you. Like, the system's not coming to save you. You want to get through this war? You want to get this stuff ready? Go get it done. Go use what you can. Go think creatively. Go call up every Jewish American donor that you know. Go call your parents, see if they can buy you something. They can order you something. Like, this is the situation. And I'm very happy to see that seems to have changed. If you go back and you look at images of the IDF at the beginning of this war versus today, you see IDF soldiers. Some of them didn't have knee pads. Some of them didn't have vests. I met a guy in the initial invasion of northern Gaza whose his Negev, the light machine gun, I also had a Negev too, his Negev had broke to the point that I can only do a single shot at a time. And this guy was walking into, it's laughable now, and I sincerely hope he's okay, and it seems okay, but he's walking into Beit Hanun with this gun. Wow. And I'm looking at him like, you are insane.
Out of your mind, yeah.
You're out of your mind. Like, yeah, I can't imagine this. And you look at images now, and every IDF soldier, they have the tactical helmets on, they have new tactical gear, everything is brand new. And they have new gear on their weapons. It's really a step forward. I think you're absolutely right that, yes, F-35s, they are important. They have their place on the battlefield. Just this morning as well, yet another Radwan logistics commander was killed. A very high-ranking man, I think at the level of probably colonel, was killed in southern Lebanon thanks to an airstrike. These are very important weapons. They're extremely essential, but for fighting a ground force like Hamas, you're right. You need to invest in your soldiers. And ultimately, too, I think as well, if you're gonna look at the Americans in Iraq and Afghanistan, you have to say to yourself, okay, if this really is the kind of war we're going to fight, this is a multi-decade style war, and we need to think also not just in terms of strategy, but in terms of economics as well, and how those two are intertwined. Okay, so I know we wanted to keep things in the United States, and I definitely want to bring it back. We talk about Bibi's speech. Let's talk about, and you mentioned the RNC already, and I think it's a great place to start. First of all, Donald Trump with the bandage on his ear. Dude, what did you think about that assassination attempt? Because, wow, that was wild.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank God he's okay. Putting aside one's political opinions on Trump one way or another, I think it would have been a major blow to American democracy had Donald Trump been assassinated in the midst of a campaign where he really was and he still is today, the favorite pick of much of the American electorate. That would have been a major blow to American democracy.
Mm.
And first of all, thank God that he's okay and he came out of it whole. Maybe a little bit less. Part of his ear was cut off, but he came out of it full and well. And if Joe Biden thought that he had any chance of winning prior to the assassination attempt, I think this pretty much sealed it.
Wow. Yeah, there's rumors flying about too. Some verified, some unverified. For instance, closed-door meetings with Chuck Schumer, Nancy Pelosi, even Barack Obama, all of whom, these major Democratic figures who are basically telling Joe Biden, step aside. Like, this is not your race. We're going to lose the presidency, we're going to lose the House, we're going to lose the Senate if you don't step aside. And there are actually rumors flying around. I saw on one of the alternative media channels that I like to listen to that Biden this weekend might be making an announcement that he will be stepping down at the end of his term.
It is definitely possible that that'll happen. I will say one thing. First of all, to reference what you're talking about, I think, it's really 50-50 by this point, the way I look at it. And I think, Biden might make an announcement that he's stepping down. He might stick it out and continue and be resilient until the very end. I will add one note that I think our listeners should think about, and maybe we could talk about this a little bit. In every election where months and months of an election cycle go by and there's a certain crowned victor of the election and everybody knows that person's going to win, these oftentimes tend to be the elections where the results are most unexpected. Why do I say that? If everybody goes into this election thinking that Donald Trump has a sure chance of victory, this might affect voter turnout to a certain degree. Mm-hmm. I think that there's a lot of Donald Trump supporters that are very hardcore, are going to show up with all of the, like you said, all the rabak in the world, and are going to want to support Donald Trump and give him the vote that they think he deserves. But I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of people say, yeah, Trump's going to win. When am I going to go out and vote right now against Biden? And we might see something of an unexpected voting results coming out in November as we get closer to the election. So one thing that we ought to keep in mind as we hear all of this murmuring about Donald Trump trouncing Joe Biden in the upcoming election. But yeah, let's see if Joe Biden's gonna quit.
You're absolutely right that look, there's nothing's written in stone. Anything can happen. We can have I think obviously the favor is Donald Trump at this point for a couple of reasons. One, unlike the Democrats who are incredibly divided, you have the far left pushing back against the sort of moderate left, and they have like the Joe Manchin side of the party as well, who are basically neocons but just have the title Democrat. The short of it is the Democratic Party is extraordinarily divided, whereas the Republican Party, for the first time in a couple decades, is presenting a truly united front. I mean, we think about last election with Donald Trump, or I guess I would say two elections ago, back in 2016, where Donald Trump, he gained the Republican primary, and the Republican establishment was furious. They did not want to support him. They did not like that this guy was now being dragged in by the voters. He was very much a populist president. He has since changed the tune of the Republican Party. The Republican Party is the party of Donald Trump. The idea of, this Donald Trump or Trumpism, whatever you want to call it, has very much become mainstream within the Republican Party, and they seem very united around him. That's one. That's why it gives, I think, the Republicans a huge advantage. And the second advantage is kind of what you said as well. Like, there are a lot of voters who are willing and eager to come out and vote for Donald Trump. And Joe Biden just he doesn't garner that same enthusiasm.
He doesn't have that appeal.
He does not have that appeal at all. Even people who vote for him are very just like, they're very resigned to the vote. It's a vote against Trump, basically.
Right.
That's how a lot of people who I've spoken with, and what appears to be the sentiment for a lot of Biden voters, that it's just, for them, it's a vote against Trump. They just don't want this guy back in office. And I think that if I had to put money on it, I would say that Trump's going to win, but the Democrats are in a rock and a hard place, because who do they pick if Biden steps down?
Yeah.
They have Kamala Harris as VP. She's not particularly popular. There's rumors of Hillary Clinton stepping back in. I think that would be a disaster. It's once again a Trump-Hillary election. We all kind of know how that ended. Hillary has not gotten more popular in her retirement. I don't know who the Democrats would pick, and who really has a chance against a guy like Donald Trump.
Yeah. It's not clear. I think also, when we talk about appeal, what you mentioned earlier, that the global trend that we've been seeing over the past 10, 15 years, and I think this is played out both in the repeated election of Prime Minister Netanyahu and the likely re-election of President Trump, is that voters like to vote for anti-establishment leaders to lead the establishment.
Mm-hmm.
And
It's a great
Biden
point.
is the establishment. He is and embodies the establishment.
Wow, in more ways than in more ways than one too. Now you say that he is the old, ineffective, decrepit, confused establishment.
Right. And Trump and Bibi, for that matter, even though one can laugh at Prime Minister Netanyahu as being not a part of the establishment, he is the corrupt core of Israel's political establishment. But from his voters' perspective, and perspective is the only thing that matters here, the voters in Israel and in America look at Bibi and Trump respectively and see this anti-establishment rabble-rouser that is looking to fight from within the system to look out for the interests of the common man.
Just, you know what? Just real quick, can you dive into that a little bit more? How is a guy like Bibi Netanyahu, who has been prime minister now for 2 decades, how is he still seen as the anti-establishment guy?
It's an amazing question, and there's no, in my opinion, logical answer to the question. But I can answer the perspective-based answer to the question. Meaning, I can at least share the perspective that I hear on Netanyahu, as much as it amazes me every time I hear this perspective. The common perspective that I hear on Netanyahu from his supporters is that the prime minister is a position that does not have any actual power. All the real power in Israel is run by the left-wing media, the left-wing courts, the left-wing bureaucratic establishment that runs the government.
And business interests.
And business interests. Basically, a whole bunch of, as you say in Hebrew, a whole bunch of smolanim, a whole bunch of left-wingers that run the country. And Bibi doesn't even have any control over the army. That's something that I also heard a lot after October 7th, kind of giving Bibi a slide for not dealing properly with the events of October 7th and not giving a proper military answer to October 7th, that he doesn't even run the army, he doesn't run the defense establishment. The prime minister is largely a non-powerful figure that is a part of the establishment, but it doesn't run the establishment. And they support Bibi because what Bibi is trying to do is really to give power back to the democratically elected establishment, the prime minister and his cabinet, away from the non-democratically elected political bigwigs that exist everywhere, from the court system to journalism to everywhere else. And we really saw this in the months leading up to October 7th with the judicial reform, where Bibi was saying, this is our way with the judicial reform of giving power back to the people. The people voted me into office. The people voted my cabinet into office. They didn't vote those left-wing Supreme Court justices into office. And by reforming the judicial system and giving more power to us, we're actually giving more power to you guys, the people. And that's Bibi's way of kind of repositioning himself as being the anti-establishment member of the establishment. Complete bullshit. I think that completely disconnected from reality, but the messaging works. The messaging works amazing. And, at the end of the day, you're seeing a guy who's on and off except for one little blip where he was removed from power by Bennett and Lapid. He's been in power now in Israel since 2008, 2009.
Prior to that, too, in the 90s, from 96 to 99.
You're right. Also another time in the 90s.
Yeah, it's remarkable. In his autobiography as well, he actually writes about this, too. He describes everything you said, the left-wing, unelected media, business, and judicial system as he described it in English, he used the word cabal. Very much cabal, which ironically enough is a very anti-Semitic word, but he used it to describe these sort of left-wing powers in Israel. And he actually talks about being approached by them and how they use their influence to overthrow Sharon, and how if Bibi didn't get in line, he was going to be next. And he describes this meeting that he has with an unnamed figure who is supposed to represent this quote-unquote cabal of left-wing groups, and that forced him that he stood up to and said, I'm not going to go along with what you're saying. And I think that exactly as you said, adds into his perspective of being this anti-establishment guy. Truly, yeah, it is amazing. To clarify, maybe do we want to go through the prime minister's actual powers, or is that going to take us too long?
No, I mean, look, it's wild because, I remember one time I had a conversation with someone who was a major Bibi supporter who told me the prime minister does not have any power over the military. The prime minister has zero control over the military, and therefore he's not responsible for October 7th. That's like a summation of what he was saying to me. Now, if you look at the prime minister's actual powers, what he's actually responsible for, you see that according to Israeli law, the prime minister is a member and is the lead of Israel's security cabinet, which is the body responsible for declaring war, carrying out any major military operations, blah, 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 blah. In addition to that, you also see that according to Israeli law, the prime minister oversees the government, which is the body that the military is subordinate to. Now, there are those who counter-argue that technically speaking, the military is directly subordinate to the defense minister and is not subordinate to the prime minister. And because it's a parliamentary system and not a presidential system like in America, and the defense minister is not directly subordinate to the prime minister, and the way that the secretary of defense is subordinate to the president of the United States, that the actual fault is on the military establishment and on Gallant, but not on Prime Minister Netanyahu, because he is not directly responsible for the military. Because of the reasons that I just mentioned earlier, both his direct management of the security establishment and his management of the government, which grandly oversees the military, both of those reasons clearly make him responsible for the military and all the actions that it carry out, which to my opinion, and from my view, the opinion of most rational people that know how to read the letter of the law, would indicate that he is fully responsible for the events of October 7th.
And to go back to my earlier mini rant, I mean, this guy is more than happy to take responsibility for the hostage rescues and for the assassination of major Hamas and Hezbollah figures, but then when things go wrong, all of a sudden it's the IDF's fault.
Right. 100%.
So,
100%.
Yeah, definitely major hypocrisy going on there. I think maybe we can kind of wrap this up talking just a little bit about our episode last week. So, last week, if you really want to hear me and Michael disagree on a subject, episode 14, that's one that we really got into some heated debates on. Basically, just one of the biggest things we discussed was whether or not Trump is going to be a major supporter of Israel should he be elected. And what was so interesting to me was actually watching the RNC. I didn't watch the whole thing, but I watched various clips of it, and there was a lot of support. And again, we're talking about a very united Republican Party showing a lot of support for Israel, and it to the point where speakers would get on stage and they would pause to do a prayer, which is quite normal at the RNC, but the prayer would be based around the return of the hostages, the Israeli and American hostages currently sitting in Gaza, back to their respective home countries. Which to me was indicative of, my comment last week was that Trump throughout the duration of this war has very much been Israel needs to stop the war right away because they're losing the propaganda war and they're losing face in the international community, and this is going to come back and bite them in the ass the way that apartheid kind of bit South Africa. He's since changed that tune, I think largely due to the influence of his wealthy Republican Jewish donors. Not to get conspiratorial, that's just truly what I think is going on. And he's changed his tune now to very much being like, Israel needs to take the gloves off and wrap this war up in a couple months. Regardless of what he actually thinks and what he's actually going to do in office, it's tough to say. But even if he wants to go back to option one of forcing Israel to stop the war without that clear sort of victory that Bibi's been talking about, I think he's going to face a lot of pushback from the Republican Party. He might end up kind of putting himself in a jam to where the Republicans essentially force him into allowing Israel to take the gloves off and saying, look, if you want to pass any other measures or you want to pass any other laws or do what you want to do, you need to do this first. And I don't know if this is a battle really that Trump wants to fight. I don't think he cares that passionately about Israel one way or another.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I guess really the question is, what does that mean to take the gloves off? What does that mean for Israel to take the gloves off in this battle in Gaza?
I think it means a couple things. One, it means no criticism from the administration at Israel. The Biden administration has been very uncritical for the most part, but they've certainly not been afraid to voice some displeasure towards the Netanyahu administration. The second thing is, I think, just allowing Israel to have whatever weapons they want. So at this point, Biden has not been giving Israel the 2,000-pound bombs. They haven't been replenishing a lot of their ammunition as quickly as the Israelis would like. Something that, by the way, this is an accusation that the Netanyahu government has made towards the Biden administration, that the Biden administration has reacted to with complete shock and dismay, and how can you say this, and that's ridiculous, and blah, blah, blah. Based on IDF reports that have been made public, it does seem that there is a major ammunition shortage, and this is actually one of the deciding factors, I think, to not invade Lebanon this summer, and take the war to Hezbollah. So I think for the Trump administration, it's going to be very much giving Israel access to whatever arsenal it needs, and just not putting the political. Trump is a magnificent marketer, and if he wants to attack the leftists and whoever else for criticizing Israel, he can do that, and a lot of people are going to follow and support him, and he might be able to just change this sort of attitude that we're seeing. It also might involve things like more aggressive police action against protesters.
Yeah.
I mean, we already saw some in a few instances, some pretty aggressive police action, but I mean, I think we all know it can get a hell of a lot worse.
Yeah.
Particularly when it comes to Trump's attitudes towards who he considers to be, Antifa and the far left.
Yeah. I think you're 100% right, and I think I would add another dimension to that of humanitarian aid to Gaza, where, and we've spoken about this in previous episodes. I think in one episode you mentioned that one of the greatest tools for Israel in this war, at least in the beginning, was really holding back on a lot of the food and water going into Gaza, because once you cut off that lifeline of food and water going into Gaza, you can really, from a, there might be some moral questions there, but from a pure cold military perspective, you really cut off that lifeline for Hamas to both feed and take care of its own troops, and at the same time also be able to use those resources and sell them in order to continue to fund the war effort and buy more weapons and to continue fight against Israel in this long-term insurgency. If Trump gives Bibi the lifeline to do what the Democrats weren't able to do, which is to say even cut off all the humanitarian aid going into Gaza and cut off all the water going into Gaza and all the food going into Gaza and completely dry Gaza out, especially now that Israel has already conquered the Philadelphia corridor and completely is preventing, or can supposedly prevent, any movement of goods and services between Egypt and the Gaza Strip. That could be a huge game changer for the war in the Gaza Strip. And if Donald Trump is looking at giving Israel a way to take off the gloves and end the war in a couple of months, that might be one way, not necessarily moral, there's a question there, but that might be one way of going about doing that.
I got to ask the question. I know this is a rough question, but I'm going to ask it anyways. Would you support that kind of a policy, reimposing the siege?
It's difficult. Look, there's no part of me that wants to see innocent civilians being stuck in a situation where, because of their tyrannical leaders, the Hamas leadership in Gaza, they don't have access to food and water. In my ideal, would like to see a situation where, on the one hand, Israel cuts off all supplies going into the Gaza Strip in a complete sense to make sure that the food and water that's going to Gaza doesn't inevitably fall into the hands of Hamas, because that's what happens, and simultaneously provide some sort of answer, maybe within Israeli territory, maybe in the border area to the Gaza Strip, in which it provides food and water directly to the residents of the Gaza Strip and can ensure that the materials get directly into the hands of people that actually need it. Because again, I don't think Israel gains any real military advantage here from starving the people of Gaza. I just, one might look at it from the perspective of it'll hurt Hamas's domestic support if the people of Gaza are starving. That might be true, but I don't think that's the sort of game that Israel wants to play, and I don't think that that's going to really make the change here for Israel. I do think the game changer here is if Hamas loses those resources to fund its own war effort and to provide food and water for its own people. So if Israel can find out a way to make sure that food and water only gets to the civilians in Gaza and can starve out the Hamas leadership and its minions in the Gaza Strip, I think that would be the best way of going about it.
And that brings us full circle, because in order to do something like that, you essentially need to take de facto government control over the region, which requires some kind of counterinsurgency strategy. Right back to where we started.
Right back to where we started. Great way to tie it back after 15 episodes against the keyboards.
I will never stop pushing this policy. I understand that it's never going to happen. I can shout into the ether as much as I want, but we've got a podcast, a very small one, but for everyone who's listening, I'm going to always be pushing the counterinsurgency strategy, because I believe it is not only the most effective way to win the war, but it's the most effective way to create a long-lasting peace, to ensure that our children aren't going to be enlisted or to have to live through on October 7th, which for many of us was the worst day of our lives, and to be able to save more lives and to prevent the deaths of who knows how many untold thousands of Palestinians and Israelis, and really create a long-lasting solution. And to tie it back to just more of a philosophical and sort of existential point, we have, as the Jewish people, we have a long history of preaching morality and pointing to our religion as being one that is a light unto nations. And I don't know how we can square that circle if we impose a famine, one of the most devastating things that any civilization can endure. And if we impose a famine on a people because as a military option, I think that's just too dark of a mark on not only Israeli history but Jewish history as a whole, and completely nullifies any justification for Israel as a existing state.
I agree with you.
All right, guys. Praying for better days, of course. Thank you very much for listening. We'll see you all probably in a couple weeks. Take care.